The battle within. When the flesh tries to silence the spirit, there is a war that no one sees, but everyone feels. A battle that unfolds not on the outside, but deep within the soul. It is ancient, constant, and inescapable. Every human being, no matter their time, culture, or beliefs, has confronted this inner conflict, the struggle between the flesh and the spirit. The flesh pulls downward. It anchors the heart to impulses, cravings, reactions, and fears. It is instinctive, loud, impatient, and restless. The flesh demands satisfaction, demands urgency, demands dominance. But the spirit moves differently. The spirit calls upward. It whispers rather than shouts. It guides rather than forces. It teaches instead of tempting. The spirit carries the wisdom of eternity, the conscience that points toward what is right, the quiet strength that desires purity, purpose, discipline, and truth. Between these two forces, the human soul becomes a battleground. And no external victory has meaning if the war inside remains lost. This battle is not theoretical. It is lived every day, in every choice, in every moment of temptation, in every internal resistance that rises against what we know we should do. The flesh tries to silence the spirit with noise, noise of desire, noise of excuses, noise of distractions, noise of emotions that come like storms. The spirit tries to bring clarity, alignment, and peace. But peace cannot exist without mastery, and mastery does not come without war. The ancient writers, prophets, and apostles understood this conflict profoundly. They spoke of the inner war not as a weakness, but as a defining mark of spiritual growth. They described how the flesh opposes the spirit and how the spirit must govern the flesh if the soul is to live in freedom. Throughout the centuries, these teachings have guided countless individuals who found themselves divided within. Their wisdom can guide you as well. This text is not about external enemies, nor about the visible world. It is about the unseen movements of your own heart. It is about understanding why you feel pulled in opposite directions. It is about identifying the subtle ways the flesh tries to dominate your decisions. And it is about empowering your spirit to rise, to lead, and to reclaim its rightful place. If you have ever felt torn between what you want and what you know is right, this text is for you. If you have ever felt spiritually drained because your impulses were louder than your convictions, this text is for you. If you have ever sensed a higher calling but found yourself trapped in lower desires, this text is for you. You are not alone. You are not weak. You are simply human. And this internal war is proof that your spirit is alive, active, and unwilling to surrender. Let us now enter the first deep reflection of this journey, the voice of the flesh. How internal resistance tries to dominate the soul. The voice of the flesh is a voice that rarely speaks softly. It is a force that operates through impulses, cravings, instinctive reactions, emotional turbulence, and psychological patterns shaped over years of survival, fear, and desire. To understand the battle within, one must understand how this voice is formed, how it manipulates the mind, how it influences emotions, and how it rises to silence the spirit whenever the spirit attempts to grow stronger. The flesh is not merely the body, it is the sum of every human weakness. It is the part of us that attaches to comfort, resists discipline, and fears transformation. It wants what is easy, quick, familiar, and immediately pleasurable. It recoils from anything that threatens its dominance: spiritual awakening, moral conviction, self-control, or deep introspection. The flesh wants to survive, but the spirit wants to transcend. Here lies the conflict. From the moment a person begins to awaken spiritually, the flesh becomes aware that its dominance is threatened. That is when resistance intensifies. Many people believe their weaknesses grow stronger when they try to improve, but in reality, it is simply that the flesh feels cornered. It begins to fight more aggressively. This resistance can manifest in countless forms: procrastination, emotional instability, sudden distractions, irrational cravings, fatigue that appears only when spiritual practices begin, anxiety that surfaces at the moment of decision, and even self-sabotage disguised as logic. The flesh is an expert at disguising itself. It does not always present as temptation. Sometimes it presents as convenience or logic or even self-protection. A person may feel the urge to pray, but suddenly remember a task that seems more urgent. They may feel a pull towards silence and reflection, but the mind becomes noisy with irrelevant thoughts. They may decide to discipline themselves, but excuses arise with astonishing speed and intelligence. The flesh does not need to win through power. It wins through persuasion, confusion, and delay. The first form of resistance is emotional. Emotions are powerful forces, and the flesh uses them like weapons. It floods the heart with feelings that destabilize spiritual clarity. Fear is one of the most effective. Fear of failure, fear of change, fear of judgment, fear of loss, fear of discomfort. Fear can paralyze the soul before it even attempts to rise. The flesh whispers, "Do not try. You may lose. You may look foolish. You may face pain." And the soul, overwhelmed by the emotional intensity, hesitates. The flesh also uses desire. Desire is not inherently wrong, but uncontrolled desire becomes a chain. It convinces the mind that satisfaction is the highest goal. It reduces the human being to appetite. It persuades the soul that discomfort is the enemy and pleasure is the path. Under the influence of desire, spiritual disciplines feel unnecessary, even impossible. The flesh says, "Why restrain yourself? Why wait? Why deny what you want?" And many fall because the voice of desire speaks loudly and persistently. Another emotional weapon is discouragement. The flesh makes you believe you are too broken, too weak, too inconsistent to grow spiritually. It brings memories of past failures, magnifies them, and uses them to create hopelessness. It says, "You have tried before and failed. Why try again? This is who you are." Discouragement kills progress because it kills belief. The flesh cannot dominate someone who believes they can overcome, so it attacks belief. It whispers self-doubt into the heart until the soul becomes tired, defeated, and resigned to familiar patterns. Emotional resistance is powerful because emotions feel real. They feel urgent, they feel definitive, but they are not the truth. They are weapons, tools, and illusions used by the flesh to maintain its throne. The second form of resistance is mental. The mind is the battlefield where most spiritual wars are won or lost. The flesh shapes thought patterns that justify weakness, rationalize wrongdoing, and protect harmful habits. It creates arguments that sound logical but are designed to maintain comfort. For example, "I deserve this indulgence after a long day. I can change later. One more time will not hurt." Everyone struggles with this, so it is normal. It is pointless to fight because no one is perfect anyway. These thoughts are not random. They are strategic. They are designed to keep the soul asleep. And because they sound reasonable, many people never recognize their origin. Mental resistance also appears as distraction. When the spirit tries to lead the mind toward reflection, growth, or truth, the flesh interrupts with noise. Suddenly, thoughts about trivial things become urgent. Suddenly, attention is fragmented. Suddenly, the mind becomes restless. The flesh fears stillness because the spirit speaks most clearly in stillness. It fears silence because silence reveals truth. Therefore, distraction becomes a constant tool. If a person tries to meditate, they remember tasks. If they try to reflect, their mind wanders. If they attempt self-discipline, new ideas appear to pull them away. The flesh does not need to destroy the spirit. It only needs to distract it long enough for growth to slow down and eventually stop. Another mental tactic is confusion. The flesh creates internal conflict by presenting multiple thoughts at once. It clouds judgment. It makes a person overthink. It creates scenarios that never happened. It causes anxiety about the future and guilt about the past. Confusion weakens spiritual decisiveness. When a person is confused, they hesitate. When they hesitate, they do not act. When they do not act, the flesh remains in control. Mental resistance often feels like a storm that comes from within. But the storm is not a signal of weakness. It is a signal that the spirit is trying to rise and the flesh is fighting back. The third form of resistance operates through the body. Fatigue that appears specifically during spiritual practices is not always physical. Sometimes it is spiritual resistance manifesting through the body. A person may feel exhausted when they try to pray or study something meaningful, but feel alert when engaging in meaningless entertainment. They may struggle to wake up early for discipline, but have no problem staying awake late for distractions. The body often becomes the battlefield where the flesh asserts dominance. It uses cravings, lethargy, tension, or discomfort to keep the spirit subdued. When the spirit attempts to impose discipline, fasting, silence, solitude, study, or self-control, the flesh responds with bodily resistance. It tries to convince the mind that discipline is too heavy or too painful, but growth requires discomfort. Transformation requires effort. Mastery requires sacrifice. The flesh knows this and uses the body as a shield against spiritual elevation. The fourth form of resistance is behavioral. Habits created over years do not disappear easily. The flesh seeks routine, repetition, familiarity. It resists new patterns because new patterns empower the spirit. When a person tries to break harmful habits, the flesh reacts with urgency. It demands what it is accustomed to. It creates cravings, restlessness, and frustration. Behavioral resistance is often the most visible form because it manifests in actions. It is the loop of falling into the same behaviors even when the mind knows they are harmful. This creates guilt, and guilt creates vulnerability. In guilt, the flesh says, "You see, you cannot change. This is who you are." And if the person believes this lie, the cycle repeats. The fifth form of resistance is spiritual blindness. The flesh tries to silence the spirit, not only through emotions, thoughts, or actions, but also by dulling spiritual sensitivity. It makes a person indifferent to what once moved them deeply. It numbs the conscience. It weakens intuition. It makes spiritual truths feel distant, irrelevant, or difficult to grasp. This is the most dangerous form because when the spirit's voice becomes faint, the flesh becomes almost impossible to detect. A person may think they are living freely, but in reality, they are governed by impulses. The flesh gives them temporary comfort, but long-term emptiness. The spirit brings temporary struggle, but long-term freedom. This is the nature of the battle. Yet, this resistance, no matter how strong, cannot overpower the spirit if the spirit remains awake and disciplined. The flesh becomes powerful only when the spirit becomes passive. When the spirit rises with clarity, conviction, and persistence, the flesh loses its authority. The truth is that the flesh is not an enemy to be destroyed, but a force to be mastered. It must be ruled, not followed. It must be disciplined, not obeyed. It must be placed under the authority of the spirit so that the soul can live in alignment with its higher purpose. The first step toward mastery is awareness. When you recognize the strategies of the flesh, you stop being controlled by them. You begin to see the patterns, the illusions, the emotional traps, the mental tricks. You begin to separate your true self from your impulses. And when you separate the two, the spirit gains strength. Understanding the voice of the flesh is not about blame, but about clarity. Clarity gives power, and power gives choice. Once you understand how the flesh operates, you are no longer reacting blindly. You become intentional. You become aware. You become capable of choosing the voice of the Spirit even when the voice of the flesh screams louder. The flesh may try to silence the Spirit, but it cannot extinguish it. The Spirit is eternal, while the impulses of the flesh are temporary. The Spirit carries truth, while the flesh operates through illusion. The Spirit seeks growth, while the flesh seeks comfort. Growth will always be uncomfortable, but comfort will never lead to growth. At the deepest level, the battle within is a battle of identity. Who are you? The flesh claims you are your desires, cravings, impulses, fears, and emotions. But the Spirit says you are more. You are capable of mastery, discipline, purpose, resilience, and spiritual elevation. The flesh limits you to the moment. The Spirit connects you to eternity. The flesh wants you to survive. The Spirit wants you to awaken. When you choose which voice to follow, you choose who you become. The battle within is not easy, but it is meaningful. It is the path to self-mastery, to inner freedom, to spiritual clarity. Each time you resist the flesh, you strengthen the Spirit. Each time you say no to impulses and yes to purpose, you rise. Each moment of discipline builds a new layer of truth within you. Every struggle has a purpose, to reveal the strength of your spirit. And as long as the battle continues, it means your spirit is still fighting, still alive, still refusing to be silenced. This is not a sign of defeat, it is a sign of awakening. If you feel the weight of this battle, understand that you are exactly where transformation begins. And transformation is not for the weak, it is for the brave. The Spirit within you is calling, guiding, urging you toward a higher version of yourself. Do not let the flesh silence that call. Listen deeper, rise stronger, fight wiser. The battle may be internal, but its victories will shape your entire life. If this message helped you reflect, remember to subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next chapters of this journey. The Whisper of the Spirit, awakening the inner voice. That the flesh fears. The Spirit does not shout like the flesh. It does not fight for attention with urgency, pressure, or emotional storms. Instead, the Spirit speaks with a quiet authority that is often easy to overlook but impossible to replace once recognized. If the voice of the flesh is loud, immediate, and demanding, the voice of the Spirit is subtle, patient, and deeply rooted in truth. It calls the soul toward a path that is not always comfortable, but always meaningful. And therein lies the great challenge. The Spirit's voice is quieter, not because it lacks power, but because it refuses to manipulate, overwhelm, or force itself the way the flesh does. The Spirit seeks a willing listener, not a captive follower. The Spirit desires alignment, not submission. It invites but never coerces, it guides but never drags. To hear the Spirit, therefore, one must learn to overcome the noise the flesh produces and cultivate an inner sensitivity that perceives truth even in the faintest whisper. The Spirit does not operate through impulse but through intention. It does not react to the moment but sees beyond the moment. While the flesh is confined to the immediate and the temporary, the Spirit operates from a place beyond time. It carries the wisdom of experiences not yet lived, the clarity of consequences not yet felt, and the understanding of purposes not yet fulfilled. For this reason, its guidance is sometimes difficult to accept. The Spirit may ask for restraint when the flesh demands indulgence. It may guide you towards silence when the flesh craves stimulation. It may call you to wait when the flesh insists on immediate gratification. The Spirit may lead you toward forgiveness while the flesh seeks revenge. It may command sacrifice while the flesh runs toward comfort. These oppositions create friction within the soul, and that friction is often mistaken for confusion. But it is not confusion, it is awakening. The awakening of the Spirit often begins with discomfort. When the Spirit starts to rise, the flesh feels threatened, and therefore the inner resistance intensifies. but beneath the discomfort, there is a growing clarity. You begin to notice when something feels wrong, even before you can articulate why. The Spirit reveals the truth, not first through words, but through conviction. Conviction is the deeper knowing that something aligns or misaligns with your higher self. It is a sense of inner rightness or wrongness that arises not from fear, guilt, or external pressure, but from the integrity of the Spirit itself. Conviction does not condemn you, it calls you upward. It does not shame you, it awakens you. It does not imprison you, it frees you. The flesh sees conviction as a threat, because conviction breaks illusions. When you know the truth deeply, the lies of the flesh lose their power. Another way the Spirit speaks is through restlessness of the soul. This is not the anxiety of the flesh, which is chaotic and fearful. Rather, it is a spiritual discomfort that signals misalignment. It is the inner sense that something in your life is out of order, not because it is unpleasant, but because it lacks purpose, honesty, or alignment with your deeper calling. Many people try to silence this restlessness with distraction, entertainment, or constant activity, but the Spirit continues to whisper, urging change. This restlessness can manifest in unexpected ways. Loss of interest in shallow routines, discomfort with relationships that drain your energy, dissatisfaction with meaningless pursuits, or a hunger for deeper understanding. These are not weaknesses, but signs that the Spirit is awakening, refusing to be silenced anymore. The Spirit also speaks through moments of unusual clarity. These are moments when you suddenly see a situation differently than before, when you gain insight that feels beyond your own reasoning, when you sense a direction that was not obvious previously. This clarity may appear during quiet reflection, during solitude, during emotional struggles, or even in the middle of ordinary tasks. The flesh tries to drown out these moments with noise, but the Spirit uses them to guide you gently toward truth. Some people call this intuition, some call it conscience, and some call it spiritual discernment. But whatever name one gives it, its essence is the same. It is the voice that knows. It does not guess. It does not speculate. It knows. One of the greatest obstacles to hearing the voice of the Spirit is the internal chaos created by the flesh. The flesh thrives on noise, emotional noise, mental noise, physical noise, environmental noise. Noise keeps the mind distracted, the heart reactive, and the soul numb. In silence, the flesh weakens, because silence brings awareness. Silence reveals patterns. Silence exposes illusions. Silence uncovers truths hidden beneath the surface of daily life. This is why many resist silence. It confronts them with themselves. But silence is the natural environment of the Spirit. If you want to hear the Spirit's voice, you must create moments of stillness in your life. Not stillness as the absence of movement, but stillness as the absence of internal turbulence. Stillness that allows you to perceive what is usually overshadowed by noise. The Spirit also speaks through longing, not the cravings of the flesh, which are rooted in impulse, but the deep longing of the soul for meaning, connection, purpose, and transcendence. This longing often emerges when a person achieves what the flesh desires, but still feels empty. It is the recognition that pleasure does not satisfy the spirit, that comfort does not fulfill the soul, and that external success cannot substitute for inner alignment. The longing of the Spirit is a pull towards something greater. It is the call to rise above the ordinary, to seek truth, to cultivate discipline, to live intentionally. This longing may manifest as a sense that you are meant for something more than the patterns that currently dominate your life. It is not arrogance, it is awakening. It is the Spirit reminding you that you are not created merely to follow impulses, but to master them. Another powerful way the Spirit speaks is through the consequences of ignoring it. When the voice of the Spirit is repeatedly silenced, life becomes increasingly chaotic. The flesh may provide temporary pleasure, but it always leads to long-term emptiness. The spirit offers long-term fulfillment, though it often requires short-term struggle. When a person consistently chooses the flesh over the spirit, they may experience confusion, instability, disconnection, or a loss of inner peace. These are not punishments, they are signals. They are the spirit's way of revealing that something is out of order. The consequences of ignoring the spirit become a guide toward listening more closely. Eventually, the inner turmoil becomes too strong to ignore, and the person begins to turn inward again, seeking the voice they once silenced. One of the most profound ways the spirit works is through transformation. The spirit does not simply point out what is wrong, it empowers you to change. It does not merely illuminate weaknesses, it strengthens you to overcome them. When the spirit awakens, transformation becomes possible. Habits that once seemed unbreakable begin to lose their grip. Emotional wounds that once controlled your reactions begin to heal. Patterns of self-sabotage begin to dissolve. The awakening of the spirit brings a shift in perspective, a shift in values, and a shift in identity. You begin to see yourself not as a prisoner of the flesh, but as a being capable of mastery and discipline. You begin to choose differently, not because you are forcing yourself, but because your desires are changing. This is one of the strongest indications that the spirit is active. Your priorities begin to shift. The spirit transforms not only behavior, but perception. You begin to see situations with greater clarity. You begin to understand what truly matters and what is merely noise. You recognize what drains your spirit and what nourishes it. You begin to detach from things that once had power over you. You develop patience, resilience, humility, and inner strength. These changes may appear slowly, but they are profound and lasting. While the flesh seeks immediate gratification, the spirit is committed to long-term growth. And growth, even when slow, is powerful. Every small decision that aligns with the spirit weakens the dominance of the flesh. Transformation does not come from force, it comes from consistency. Listening to the spirit requires intentional practice. One must cultivate sensitivity through discipline. This discipline is not harshness, but commitment. It involves creating space in your life for reflection, solitude, silence, and introspection. It involves questioning your impulses instead of obeying them blindly. It involves observing your emotions without letting them control your decisions. It involves distinguishing between the voice of fear and the voice of truth. It involves recognizing that the spirit often leads you toward difficult choices because difficult choices produce growth. The more you listen to the spirit, the stronger its voice becomes. The more you obey it, the quieter the flesh becomes. One of the greatest signs that the spirit is leading you is peace. The flesh may offer pleasure, excitement, or adrenaline, but it cannot offer lasting peace. Peace is the signature of spiritual alignment. Peace does not always mean comfort. It means inner clarity and stability, even in discomfort. When a decision aligns with the spirit, there is a quiet peace that accompanies it, even if the decision is difficult. When a decision aligns with the flesh, there may be pleasure or relief, but it is followed by inner conflict, guilt, or emptiness. Learning to recognize this difference is essential in hearing the Spirit's voice. Another way the Spirit speaks is through inner strength in moments of temptation. When the flesh tries to pull you downward, the Spirit gives you the ability to resist. This resistance may not feel dramatic, but it is powerful. It is the moment when you say no to something that once controlled you. It is the moment when you choose restraint over indulgence. It is the moment when you walk away from something that drains your soul. The Spirit empowers you with self-control, not because you are perfect, but because you are aligned. The flesh tries to silence the Spirit. The Spirit tries to liberate you from the flesh. There will be times when the voice of the Spirit feels distant, not because it is silent, but because the noise of the flesh is too loud. During these times, many people feel abandoned or confused, but the Spirit does not abandon. The Spirit is constant, steady, unchanging. It is the soul's compass, always pointing toward truth. When the Spirit feels distant, it is often a sign that the person must quiet the noise rather than demand louder guidance. Sometimes the Spirit whispers because it wants you to lean in, to listen more carefully, to develop deeper awareness. The flesh demands comfort. The Spirit develops maturity. An awakened spirit begins to influence every area of life. It shapes your relationships by making you more patient, empathetic, and discerning. It shapes your choices by aligning your actions with your values. It shapes your habits by creating consistency. It shapes your identity by reminding you who you truly are. When the Spirit leads, the soul becomes anchored. You are no longer tossed by emotional waves or driven by impulsive desires. You become stable, grounded, centered. The flesh loses its dominance when the Spirit stands firm. Another profound way the Spirit operates is through truth. The Spirit is aligned with truth at all levels: emotional truth, moral truth, spiritual truth, personal truth. It exposes lies you tell yourself, lies you inherited from others, and lies you accepted because they were comfortable. The flesh thrives in deception because deception keeps you from growing, but the Spirit seeks honesty, even when honesty is painful. Truth liberates the soul from illusions. Truth destroys the strongholds built by the flesh. Truth reveals who you are and who you must become. When the Spirit awakens, truth becomes non-negotiable. The awakening of the Spirit is not a one-time event, but a continuous process. It grows stronger the more you nurture it. The more you obey the Spirit, the more it transforms your life. But this journey requires courage, because the Spirit often challenges the deepest attachments of the flesh. It challenges comfort, pride, fear, and old identities. It challenges relationships that drain your soul. It challenges habits that keep you small. It challenges beliefs that limit your growth. The Spirit leads you toward a life that is aligned with purpose, but purpose requires sacrifice. The flesh wants comfort, the Spirit wants calling. One of the most beautiful signs of the Spirit's awakening is the desire for depth. A person begins to crave meaningful conversations, purposeful activities, healing, growth, and genuine connection. Shallow pleasures lose their grip. Surface-level interactions feel empty. The Spirit seeks authenticity. It seeks wisdom. It seeks clarity. It seeks growth. This shift is not forced, it is natural. As the Spirit awakens, the soul naturally gravitates toward what nourishes it. The flesh begins to lose interest in meaningless distractions. The Spirit begins to dominate. Yet, even as the Spirit awakens, the flesh will continue to fight. The battle within never fully disappears because the flesh remains a part of human nature. But as the Spirit grows, the flesh becomes manageable, its voice becomes softer, its influence weakens, its resistance becomes predictable. You begin to recognize its strategies and respond with strength instead of surrender. The battle does not end, but your power within the battle transforms. You stop fighting blindly and start fighting wisely. Ultimately, the whisper of the Spirit is the key to inner freedom. It is not loud, but it is powerful. It is not urgent, but it is eternal. It is not forceful, but it is transformative. When you learn to hear it, you learn to master yourself. When you learn to follow it, you learn to rise above your impulses. When you allow it to lead, you step into the fullness of who you were created to be. The flesh may try to silence the Spirit, but the Spirit only needs one thing to overcome: your willingness to listen. If this message inspired you to look deeper within, remember to subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next steps of this journey. The War of Desire. When temptation becomes the flesh's strongest weapon, desire is one of the most powerful forces within human nature, and because it is powerful, it becomes the preferred weapon of the flesh in its attempt to dominate the soul. The flesh knows that desire is immediate, emotional, and overwhelming, capable of silencing reason and obstructing spiritual discernment. It knows that when desire becomes strong, the mind shifts its focus, the heart becomes vulnerable, and the will loses clarity. That is why temptation is not merely an external suggestion, but an internal battle that resonates deeply within the core of human experience. Desire promises satisfaction, but often leads to bondage. It promises pleasure, but often produces emptiness. It promises relief, but often delivers chaos. In this way, the flesh manipulates desire to pull the soul downward and silence the voice of the spirit. Desire is not inherently evil. It was part of the design of human nature. There are desires that are healthy, meaningful, and necessary for survival and well-being. The desire to grow, to create, to connect, to love, to understand, to build a purposeful life, these are desires that strengthen the spirit when placed in their proper alignment. But the flesh distorts desire by exaggerating it, accelerating it and directing it toward things that weaken the spirit rather than nourish it. The flesh's version of desire is impulsive, compulsive, and centered on immediate gratification. It seeks pleasure without consequence, comfort without discipline, and escape without responsibility. It does not consider the long-term cost. It does not care about spiritual integrity. It only cares about satisfying the moment, even if that moment destroys the future. Temptation begins with a subtle whisper. It rarely appears as something obviously destructive. Instead, it begins with a harmless thought or a small compromise. The flesh never asks for total surrender at once. It asks for gradual concessions. It knows that the soul is more likely to fall through small steps than through dramatic leaps. A small indulgence becomes habitual. A small justification becomes a mindset. A small compromise becomes a pattern. Slowly, the spirit becomes quiet, and the flesh grows confident. Temptation is successful not because it is strong, but because it is patient. It waits for moments of weakness. It waits for exhaustion. It waits for loneliness. It waits for frustration. It waits for emotional vulnerability. Temptation is not random. It is strategic. One of the ways desire becomes a battlefield is through emotional longing. Many temptations arise not from physical needs, but from emotional wounds. The flesh exploits loneliness, insecurity, fear, and unresolved pain. It tells the soul that a certain indulgence will bring comfort, connection, or relief. It promises that satisfying the craving will silence the emptiness inside. But desire born from wounds never heals wounds. Instead, it deepens them. The flesh convinces the heart that fulfillment lies outside in something temporary, when in truth the spirit seeks healing from within. Many people fall into cycles of destructive desire not because they are weak, but because they are hurting, and the flesh uses pain as leverage. Where there is a wound, there is vulnerability. Where there is vulnerability, temptation finds an open door. Another powerful form of temptation is the temptation of escape. The flesh knows that humans seek relief from stress, pressure, and emotional turmoil. When life becomes heavy, the flesh whispers, "Run, escape, distract yourself." This escape can take many forms: excessive entertainment, harmful habits, overindulgence, emotional withdrawal, or chasing pleasure as a numbing mechanism. The flesh does not care what the escape is, as long as it keeps the soul from facing the truth. The spirit, on the other hand, calls for endurance, patience, and inner strength. It invites the person to grow through discomfort rather than avoid it. But growth is slow, and escape is immediate. Therefore, the flesh often wins when the soul is unprepared. The battle between escape and endurance shapes much of the human experience. The flesh offers shortcuts, the spirit offers transformation. Temptation also arises in the form of pride. Pride is a desire not for pleasure, but for validation, recognition, and superiority. It is perhaps the most deceptive form of desire because it disguises itself as confidence or self-respect. Pride speaks through thoughts like, "You deserve more, you should be above them, you are right and they are wrong. You cannot allow anyone to challenge you." Pride inflates the ego and silences the humility required for spiritual growth. The flesh feeds on pride because pride disconnects the soul from truth. Pride blinds the heart, closing it to correction, accountability, and wisdom. Many spiritual falls begin not with obvious temptation, but with subtle pride. When a person begins to believe they are spiritually strong enough to handle anything, they stop being vigilant, and the flesh strikes when vigilance disappears. Another dimension of desire is the temptation for control. Humans naturally seek control over their circumstances, relationships, and outcomes. But when the desire for control becomes excessive, it leads to anxiety, frustration, and spiritual exhaustion. The flesh tells the soul that peace will come only when everything is under control. But the spirit knows that peace comes from surrender, not control. The flesh tries to silence the spirit by convincing the mind that worry is necessary, that obsession is responsible, and that anxiety is a form of protection. This is a lie. Anxiety does not protect, it imprisons. Control does not liberate, it enslaves. The desire for control traps the mind in an endless cycle of fear and planning. Meanwhile, the spirit calls for trust, patience, and acceptance. The conflict between control and surrender becomes another battlefield within the soul. Physical desires also play a significant role in the inner war. The body naturally seeks comfort, rest, pleasure, and gratification. These desires are not wrong in themselves, but the flesh amplifies them beyond their natural limits. It convinces the person that discipline is unnecessary, that effort is too difficult, and that sacrifice is pointless. The flesh exaggerates physical discomfort and uses it to justify spiritual neglect. For example, waking early to pray, reflect, or cultivate discipline becomes a battlefield. The flesh says, "You deserve more sleep. You can do this later. Rest is more important." The spirit says, "Rise, strengthen your soul. Begin your day with purpose." The body often becomes the first point of resistance. When the body is weak, the flesh becomes louder. But when the spirit leads, the body becomes a servant rather than a master. Temptation also intensifies through repetition. Each time a person gives in to a desire misaligned with the spirit, the neural pathways of habit become stronger. The flesh operates through familiarity. The more often a desire is satisfied, the more natural it feels. Eventually, the desire becomes automatic and resistance becomes more difficult. This is why breaking patterns of temptation requires more than willpower. It requires spiritual strength. The spirit breaks the cycle by shifting identity, not just behavior. When the person begins to see themselves as someone who is called higher, someone who is capable of mastery, someone who values long-term growth over short-term gratification, the grip of temptation weakens. Behavioral change follows identity change. The most dangerous aspect of temptation is not its intensity, but its subtlety. Temptation rarely announces itself as harmful. It often appears wrapped in logic, justification, or emotional resonance. The flesh is skilled at making harmful desires seem reasonable. It says things like, "You need this. You earned this. This is harmless. No one will know. Just this once. You cannot resist forever." These thoughts are not random. They are strategic attacks designed to break spiritual defenses. The spirit, on the other hand, does not argue. It simply reveals the truth. But the truth must be chosen, and the flesh ensures that the choice feels difficult. Another powerful aspect of desire is comparison. The flesh uses comparison to create dissatisfaction. When a person looks at the lives of others and feels inferior, the flesh awakens desires for recognition, status, beauty, success, or comfort that are rooted not in purpose, but in insecurity. Comparison is a doorway through which temptation enters. It tells the soul that happiness is found in becoming like others or surpassing others. But the spirit knows that comparison destroys identity. The spirit calls the soul to walk its own path, fulfill its own purpose, and cultivate gratitude rather than envy. When comparison takes root, temptation finds fertile ground. Temptation also grows through environment. The people, places, and situations a person surrounds themselves with can either strengthen the spirit or empower the flesh. Environments filled with distraction, negativity, indulgence, or spiritual emptiness amplify temptation. Environments filled with discipline, wisdom, purpose, and intention strengthen the spirit. The flesh tries to keep a person in environments that weaken their resolve. The spirit calls them to environments that elevate their life. Many battles are won or lost, not in dramatic moments, but in the subtle influence of daily surroundings. There is also the temptation of convenience. The flesh resists effort, discipline, and growth because they require energy and discomfort. It prefers the easy path. But the easy path rarely leads to spiritual growth. The spirit often requires the person to take the more difficult path, the path of patience, the path of restraint, the path of responsibility, the path of integrity. The flesh says, take the shortcut. The spirit says, walk the path. The conflict between convenience and purpose shapes a large portion of spiritual development. One of the most surprising ways temptation operates is through delayed consequences. The flesh uses the fact that consequences are not immediate to convince the person that their actions are harmless. It says, nothing happened, so it must be fine. But consequences often unfold slowly, quietly, and subtly. By the time the person realizes the cost, the habit has already taken root. The spirit, however, sees the long-term trajectory. It warns the soul before the consequences arrive. But the warning must be heeded, and that requires spiritual sensitivity. Without sensitivity, the soul mistakes silence for permission. In many cases, the battle with desire becomes a battle with identity. The flesh tries to convince the person that their desires define them. It says, this is who you are. You cannot change. You will always struggle with this. You are weak. These identity attacks are the deepest wounds inflicted by the flesh. When a person internalizes these lies, temptation becomes stronger. But the spirit speaks a different truth. You are more than your impulses. You are capable of mastery. You were created for something higher. You are becoming, not stuck. You can rise. The battle of desire becomes a battle of becoming. Spiritual growth does not eliminate temptation. It changes your response to it. The flesh may still whisper, but the spirit becomes louder within your awareness. Desire may still arise, but your ability to see through it becomes sharper. Temptation may still strike, but your conviction becomes stronger. The spirit transforms desire by redirecting it toward higher purposes. Instead of desiring indulgence, you begin to desire discipline. Instead of desiring escape, you begin to desire healing. Instead of desiring recognition, you begin to desire authenticity. Instead of desiring control, you begin to desire surrender. When the spirit leads, desire becomes an ally rather than an enemy. The war of desire is the war of human nature itself. It reveals where the soul stands, what it craves, and what it fears. It reveals the power of the flesh and the resilience of the spirit. It reveals the vulnerabilities within the heart and the strength within the will. And it reveals the path of transformation that every person must walk if they wish to rise above themselves. Temptation is not a sign of spiritual failure, it is a sign of spiritual potential. The flesh tempts most fiercely those who have the greatest capacity to overcome. Temptation is proof that the spirit is awake, because the flesh does not need to fight someone who is spiritually asleep. The key to victory in the war of desire is not suppression, but alignment. When the spirit becomes the center of your identity, desires begin to fall into their rightful place. They no longer dominate, they no longer control, they no longer silence the voice of truth. They become impulses that you observe, not masters that you obey. The more the spirit grows, the more desire becomes purified. You begin to desire what strengthens your soul rather than what weakens it. You begin to desire what brings peace rather than chaos. You begin to desire what aligns with your purpose rather than distracts from it. The war of desire is ongoing, but you are not powerless. Every act of resistance strengthens your spirit. Every moment of clarity weakens the flesh. Every decision aligned with truth builds inner freedom. And every victory, even the smallest, becomes a declaration that the spirit within you is rising. If this chapter strengthened your journey, remember to subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next message. The discipline of mastery, training the soul to rise above the flesh. Mastery is not an event, it is a discipline. It is not a sudden transformation, but a gradual shaping of the soul through choices, practices, and internal victories that accumulate over time. The battle between flesh and spirit cannot be won through inspiration alone. Inspiration awakens desire, but discipline builds transformation. The flesh is naturally stronger in the beginning because it speaks the language of immediacy, instinct, and emotional energy. The spirit, on the other hand, becomes stronger through consistency. Discipline is the bridge that allows the spirit to rise above the impulses of the flesh. Without discipline, the flesh dominates. With discipline, the spirit takes command. Mastery begins when a person decides to no longer be guided by what they feel in the moment, but by what they know is true and necessary for their growth. Training the soul requires intentionality. The flesh grows automatically through neglect, but the spirit grows only through effort. The flesh thrives in comfort, while the spirit thrives in challenge. The flesh resists boundaries, but the spirit is strengthened by them. This means that discipline is not punishment, but alignment. It is the process of aligning actions with purpose, desires with values, and habits with identity. For many, the idea of discipline feels oppressive, but this is because the flesh interprets boundaries as threats to its dominance. The flesh says, "Let me lead, and you will feel good now." The spirit says, "Let me lead, and you will grow into who you were meant to be." Discipline is choosing long-term character over short-term comfort. Discipline begins with the mastery of attention. What you focus on determines what grows within you. The flesh seeks constant stimulation to keep the mind scattered and unfocused. It wants you distracted, overwhelmed with noise, mentally exhausted, and spiritually numb. The spirit, however, seeks focus, clarity, and intention. A disciplined soul learns to direct its attention deliberately rather than reactively. It chooses what to give energy to. It decides which thoughts deserve space and which do not. This form of mastery is foundational because attention shapes emotion, emotion shapes behavior, and behavior shapes identity. When you master your attention, you begin to free yourself from the automatic patterns created by the flesh. Another essential aspect of mastery is the discipline of routine. The flesh thrives in unpredictable spontaneity because spontaneity often leads to decisions based on emotion rather than intention. The spirit grows in consistency. A disciplined routine creates stability and strengthens the habits that nourish the soul. Whether it is dedicating time each day to silence, reflection, physical discipline, spiritual practice, or meaningful work, routine builds inner structure. This structure becomes a fortress against the impulses of the flesh. Without structure, even the strongest intentions collapse under the weight of emotional turbulence. Routine creates accountability. It transforms desire into habit and habit into identity. The mastery of the body is also a crucial aspect of spiritual discipline. The body is not the enemy, but it often becomes the battlefield where the flesh asserts control. When the body is weak or undisciplined, it becomes easier for the flesh to dominate through cravings, lethargy, or emotional overwhelm. Training the body through physical discipline strengthens not only physical resilience, but mental and spiritual resilience as well. When you train your body to obey intention rather than impulse, you strengthen the part of you that resists temptation. Even small acts like waking up at a consistent time, maintaining good posture, exercising, or resisting unhealthy cravings build the discipline necessary for spiritual mastery. The body becomes a servant of the spirit rather than its master. Emotional mastery is another pillar of discipline. The flesh uses emotions to control decisions, often creating storms of anger, fear, guilt, or desire that pressure the soul into reactive choices. Discipline teaches you to feel emotions without becoming governed by them. Emotional mastery does not mean suppressing feelings. It means recognizing them without surrendering your identity or your decisions to them. It means understanding that emotions are real but transient, powerful but not authoritative. The disciplined soul feels deeply but decides wisely. The flesh reacts, the spirit responds. Emotional mastery is the ability to pause, reflect, and choose the truth over the emotional impulse of the moment. Mental discipline, the training of thought, is equally vital. The mind is one of the primary battlegrounds where the flesh tries to break the spirit. Thoughts of doubt, fear, temptation, justification, and self-sabotage can shape a person's entire life if left unexamined. Mastery requires that you observe your thoughts consciously rather than accepting them as truth. Many people believe they are their thoughts, but disciplined individuals understand that thoughts are not rulers, they are suggestions. The spirit evaluates thoughts before allowing them to influence behavior. Mental discipline involves replacing destructive thought patterns with ones aligned with truth, purpose, and integrity. Over time, the mind becomes a powerful ally of the spirit rather than a slave of the flesh. Another important aspect of mastery is the discipline of speech. Words carry spiritual weight. They shape reality, relationships, identity, and atmosphere. The flesh uses speech impulsively, responding in anger, gossip, exaggeration, or negativity. The spirit uses speech intentionally, with clarity, honesty, restraint, and purpose. A disciplined soul learns to speak from a place of truth rather than emotion. It learns to pause before reacting, to choose silence over harmful words, and to speak in ways that build rather than destroy. Speech is often the outward expression of the inner battle. When the tongue is disciplined, the soul is steady. Mastery also requires the discipline of boundaries. The flesh resists boundaries because boundaries restrict impulsive desires. Boundaries protect the spirit by limiting access to harmful environments, relationships, or habits that weaken spiritual strength. A person who lacks boundaries is vulnerable to temptation because they constantly expose themselves to influences that empower the flesh. Boundaries create space for clarity. They protect emotional energy. They prevent the soul from being entangled in situations that drain purpose. Discipline is not only about what you do, but about what you refuse to participate in. Saying no becomes an act of power. Boundaries are shields that guard the spiritual life. Solitude and silence are also powerful disciplines. The flesh fears silence because silence reveals the truth. It strips away distraction and exposes the internal workings of the heart. It confronts the soul with itself, but the spirit thrives in silence. Solitude allows you to detach from the noise of the world and reconnect with your inner compass. Many breakthroughs in spiritual mastery occur not in activity, but in stillness. A disciplined soul creates intentional moments of silence to reflect, realign, and renew strength. Without silence, the voice of the spirit remains overshadowed by the chatter of the flesh. Solitude is not isolation, but restoration. One of the deepest aspects of mastery is the discipline of self-honesty. The flesh thrives in denial. It convinces the person to justify their actions, minimize their weaknesses, or blame others for their lack of growth. The spirit, however, demands truth. Self-honesty requires facing uncomfortable realities, patterns of self-sabotage, bad habits, emotional wounds, pride, fear, or avoidance. It requires acknowledging where you have allowed the flesh to dominate. Without honesty, discipline becomes superficial. With honesty, discipline becomes transformative. The disciplined soul looks inward with courage, acknowledging its flaws not to feel shame, but to pursue growth. Accountability is another powerful discipline. The flesh wants secrecy because secrecy protects weakness and hides spiritual decline. The spirit values accountability because accountability strengthens resolve and prevents isolation. Being accountable does not mean revealing personal struggles to everyone, but choosing trusted individuals who help maintain spiritual direction and integrity. Accountability breaks the power of hidden temptation. It prevents the flesh from whispering lies that thrive in isolation. A disciplined soul does not walk alone. It recognizes the power of supportive relationships aligned with truth. Mastery also involves the discipline of purpose. The flesh lives without purpose, wandering from one desire to another. The spirit requires direction. When you live with purpose, you make decisions aligned with your deeper calling rather than your temporary impulses. Purpose becomes a filter that determines what deserves your energy and what does not. It strengthens your ability to say no to distractions and yes to growth. Purpose transforms discipline from obligation into desire. You begin to discipline yourself, not because you are forcing yourself to, but because you understand the meaning behind your direction. Purpose gives the soul something greater to strive toward. Transcending the flesh requires the discipline of patience. The flesh demands immediate results. It wants instant satisfaction, instant success, instant resolution. But the spirit understands that transformation takes time. Patience is the ability to stay committed to the process even when progress feels slow. A disciplined soul remains steady even when results are not visible. It understands that the seeds planted today will bear fruit in due season. Patience is not passive, it is active endurance. It is the refusal to give up when the flesh becomes restless. Without patience, discipline collapses. Another essential discipline is the discipline of forgiveness. The flesh clings to anger, resentment, and bitterness because these emotions feed ego and justify emotional reactions. But the spirit understands that forgiveness is liberation. Forgiveness does not excuse wrongdoing, but breaks the chains that bind the heart to pain. It restores spiritual clarity and removes emotional barriers that block growth. A disciplined soul practices forgiveness not only toward others, but toward itself. Self-forgiveness is essential because shame and guilt are powerful tools the flesh uses to weaken the spirit. Forgiveness frees the soul to rise. Mastery also requires the discipline of humility. Humility is not weakness, but clarity. It is the recognition that the journey of the spirit is ongoing and that the flesh always remains capable of rising again if vigilance fades. Humility prevents spiritual arrogance, which is one of the most dangerous traps for the awakened soul. A disciplined person remains aware of their vulnerabilities, their tendencies, and their need for continued growth. Humility opens the heart to correction, learning, and realignment. It keeps the spirit teachable. One of the most transformative disciplines is the discipline of sacrifice. The flesh avoids sacrifice because sacrifice requires discomfort. But spiritual mastery demands that you willingly let go of anything that hinders your growth. This may include habits, relationships, environments, or desires that once felt essential. Sacrifice is not loss, it is investment. It is the deliberate choice to give up something lesser to gain something greater. Every act of sacrifice strengthens the spirit and weakens the hold of the flesh. Discipline eventually becomes identity. What begins as effort becomes habit. What begins as habit becomes character. What begins as character becomes nature. A person who consistently disciplines their inner life begins to embody strength, clarity, resilience, and wisdom. The flesh loses its power because the spirit becomes dominant. This transformation does not happen overnight, but gradually, subtly, and powerfully. Mastery is not perfection, but progression. Each day becomes a new opportunity to strengthen the spirit and weaken the flesh. The disciplined soul becomes immovable. It does not crumble under temptation. It does not surrender to emotional storms. It does not lose itself in distractions. It does not drift from its purpose. It becomes stable, grounded, and aligned. The flesh may still whisper, but its voice no longer carries authority. The spirit becomes the ruler of the inner life. Mastery is freedom. It is the liberation of the soul from the tyranny of impulse. It is the victory of truth over deception, purpose over comfort, and eternity over immediacy. This is the journey of every person who desires to rise above their own limitations. The battle is not won in a moment, but in the accumulation of disciplined choices. Discipline is the daily act of choosing the spirit over the flesh. It is the path to becoming the person you were created to be. And though the journey is difficult, its reward is profound. Mastery brings peace, clarity, strength, and purpose, qualities the flesh can never offer. If this message strengthened you, remember to subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next chapter of this journey. The final stand. When the spirit claims victory over the flesh, there comes a moment in every spiritual journey when the battle that once felt overwhelming begins to shift. It does not happen dramatically, nor does it arrive with fireworks or applause. It happens quietly, subtly, steadily, like the dawn replacing the night. This moment represents the beginning of spiritual dominion, the point at which the spirit, having endured countless challenges, temptations, and internal storms, begins to stand with a strength that the flesh can no longer easily shake. This is not the absence of battle, for as long as a person lives, the flesh will continue to whisper, push, and attempt to regain control. But this is the moment when the balance of power begins to turn. The spirit no longer fights from weakness. It fights from authority. It no longer reacts. It leads. It no longer trembles. It commands. This final battle is not about defeating the flesh once and for all, but about establishing a new order within the soul. In this stage, the spirit becomes aware of its true power. The flesh has spent years convincing the individual that spiritual strength is fragile, temporary, and inconsistent. But when the spirit reaches maturity, it discovers that its power is not emotional or circumstantial, but rooted in truth. And truth, once recognized deeply, cannot be undone. Truth does not depend on feelings, and it does not change when circumstances shift. Truth becomes the foundation upon which the soul stands firm. The flesh may still attempt to deceive, but the awakened spirit now sees through deception easily. It recognizes the patterns, the emotional manipulation, the sudden impulses, and the mental distortions. The tricks that once worked effortlessly no longer carry the same weight. The spirit becomes discerning, and discernment is one of the greatest weapons in the spiritual arsenal. At this point, the battle changes nature. In earlier stages, the flesh attacked fiercely and the spirit struggled to resist. The person felt torn, unstable, inconsistent. They rose and fell repeatedly, often feeling guilty after each fall, believing they lacked strength. But in this advanced stage, the resistance becomes different. The flesh does not disappear, but its power weakens. Its impulses lose their authority. Its voice becomes recognizable and predictable. Temptations that once felt overwhelming now appear shallow, almost transparent. They no longer create chaos within the mind. The spirit responds with calmness instead of panic. This calmness is the sign of internal victory. A person does not defeat the flesh by suppressing it, but by